Good evening and welcome to the final edition of Exploring Island Heritage. Tonight we're finding out more about a medieval castle in the island's ancient capital, Castle Rushen, and that's where we join curator of archaeology for Manx National Heritage, Alison Fox.
We can see this huge limestone status symbol in front of us, really, that has stood for about 800 years, that has been added to, taken away from, remodelled, reconstructed, used as lots of different things over the centuries, but is one of the most well-preserved medieval castles in Europe, partly because it has been used as so many different things over the years. That's what, if a building has use, then it has a purpose and it's more likely to have a value. So the fact that Castle Rushen has been used for different things has really helped it survive in the middle of the town.
How has it evolved over the centuries, I suppose?
It started off, we think, in the late 1100s under the reign of one of the Norse kings, King Rockenvalder or King Reginald, to give him his anglicised name. We think it started 1190, about 1200, and the original building, there may have been a timber fort on the site here, but the original building was probably just one storey of a stone keep, which the remains of you can still see with a bit of an eye of faith in the walls today, especially in the south side of the castle, which is where the clock face is, so the side that faces onto the castle town square, and also a little bit inside in the courtyard as well. But most of the central tower or the central keep that we see today was built in the 1300s, in the sort of 1330s to 1380s by the Lords of Man, William Montacute, and after him his son also William Montacute as well. So the structure that we see today in the middle is largely 1300s. The bank that goes around the castle that faces directly onto the square, that's covered in grass at the moment, that was a little bit later. There's a round tower as well. We think that was more in the early 1500s that was added. And Derby House, which is the more domestic looking building, I suppose, that you see to the side of the castle when you come in, was again built in the 1500s and extended in the 1600s. And then after that, the keep part of the building was used as the island's prison until the one in Victoria Road was built at the end of the 1800s. There's a courthouse on site as well, and that was used. So because it's had all these different people wanting to use it, then it's had quite a checkered history, but it's still standing.
I mean, it certainly wasn't built to be ignored.
No, it was, it's a status symbol. It's like, if it was King Reginald who built this, it was like, I'm here, sort of do what you will, but I'm here. And again, a bit like with the scale of the building at Rushen Abbey, certainly then moving on into the 1300s, where the castle, the building the height was raised and more towers added. Again, thinking about what else would have been around the landscape at that time, there would have been nothing like this. It would have been by far and away the biggest structure on the island, let alone in the south of the island, and just trying to imagine what people thought of it when they were approaching the island, what people who lived here thought of it, sort of these people come across and sort of saying, okay, well, we're going to build this here, and just imagine the local conversations as this big, massive stone building was being built up. It would have, there's no doubt it was a statement.
How many times would the castle have changed hands?
Quite a lot. Certainly, if we assume it was built under the reign of King Reginald, then he was, say, around about 1190. We had another 70 or so years of Viking rulers under that. They would have utilised the castle. In fact, the first documentary reference we have to Castle Rushen is in the Chronicles of the Kings of Man in the Isles, and they say that the very last Viking king of Man, King Magnus, died here in 1265. After that, the Isle of Man went through a period where it just was continually changing from English ownership to Scottish ownership. Again, there was no control over what happened with that. So, that's another good few. I can't count offhand, but certainly say 10, 15 people in charge of the island. Even then, if we take it into the more settled mid-1300s, every single new Lord of Man had Castle Rushen as his base and his administrative centre. So it's had a lot of some more careful than others owners, I think, over the centuries.
So this is the new bridge. This is essentially, once you've come in through the entrance, this is the first thing you'll see.
Yeah, and originally you'd have been doing pretty well if you'd got this far. The main visitor route in today is along the Barbican, we call it that sort of dogleg passageway, which was built in that configuration to stop people getting battering rams up, and again to stop people getting in too quickly. Then we have the outer gatehouse, which is where the shop is now, and if you get through all that, then you are stood in front of the big stone keep itself with our new drawbridge that's just been put in over this winter. And the original drawbridge, we think its resting place would have actually been up. So again, it's important to remember that castles were built to keep people out. If they did get in, then the configuration of them, the spiral staircases, the little rooms, were meant to confuse people. So they were never meant to be easy access visitor attractions.
It is quite a fierce-looking entrance. I suppose that's typical of a castle of this style.
Yeah, so it should be. I think a castle should never look welcoming. Again, essentially, they were places to keep people out, or latterly in the prison keep people in, so it was never meant to look friendly. And the idea behind these portcullises that you see today, they're not original, they're Victorian replicas of what might have been here, but essentially it's those kind of things. You get the big spiky gates that could be thrown down in a hurry to stop people getting in. As we walk over the drawbridge just before we enter the keep, if you look up, there are the three murder holes in the ceiling. So that's sometimes you sort of think of it, it's a bit like a Hollywood cliche of people throwing boiling oil and things down, but things could have been thrown. That's the whole point of these buildings, is to keep people out that you didn't want getting in.
It's all very brutal.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And I don't know whether it was a sign of those particular times or not, but that was the way it had to be. Things were sorted out, sometimes diplomatically, but more often than not by persuasion of one description or another. It wouldn't necessarily have been the wish for this place to have been taken over and for these defences to have had to be used in an aggressive way, but the visual statement was here that they could be. So watch your step. Basically, don't try anything, because these things are here and they would use them if they needed to be.
So we get inside, but back into the open air.
Yes, we come into the central courtyard now. That where we've just passed through is the inner gatehouse. So again, in the original Viking castle, that wouldn't have been there. There would have just been the single-storey stone keep with a set of wooden stairs to get access to the upper level. And it was just in the mid 1300s that outer gatehouse was added, and then the central stone towers are essentially turned into part of this courtyard. And when you're stood in the courtyard today, and again this is something we want to try and emphasise in the future, there are traces of areas where you can see that the remains of that very first stone tower of the Viking kings. It's not very obvious, but it is there. But at the moment we have this courtyard and we have the well, which is one of the main water sources for the castle as well.
I've just come up a spiral staircase up to the first level. Easy to get lost in here. By the time you get to the top, you're not quite sure which direction you're pointing.
You're not. You don't really know where within the castle you are. You're not really sure where on the outside, which direction you're facing. And you're also a little bit out of breath as well by the time you've scampered up all those spiral staircases as well. And again, that's the point. If that's what's happening, then the castle's doing its job. The building's doing its job very well. We've come into one of the rooms that was probably the chamber of one of the captains of the castle in the medieval period. Most of the soldiers wouldn't have lived in the castle, they would have lived outside, but the officials would have had domestic accommodation within the castle. Again, we're in a gatehouse, so we're sort of in the 1300s period part of the site here. And it's not furnished in here at the moment. Well, we've got a wooden table, but there would have been wall coverings originally. It would have been made to be a little bit more comfortable, and probably originally with a timber floor as well. At the moment, we have these big local slate slabs on the floor. These were put in when the keep was officially converted to be the official prison of the island in the 1800s, partly to stop anybody escaping, because obviously you're not going to be able to take these up like you can take floorboards up, but also because they're, of course, fireproof as well. You can't set fire to them to cause a disturbance as well. So this was probably the most recent fundamental change to the structure and content of the castle when these slate floors were put in during the prison period. Up again. So this is another level up, and really these rooms here, although present in the medieval period, the main features that we see today are actually from the prison period. We have a few of the doors. The doors aren't perhaps noticed as much as perhaps they could, because they're usually open to let people know they can come into the rooms. But these big strong wooden doors with the windows in them. Also in this room there are little attachments on the floor as well, which we think were used to tether the beds down when it was used in the prison period, again to stop riots and beds being flung about and things like that. So it's another reminder of the other use of the castle, I suppose, after the medieval period, and more the modern use of the site that we can still see evidence of today.
Now, compared to contemporary prisons, this is really quite a barren and unwelcoming place, as you'd expect, I suppose, a prison to be, certainly back then.
Yeah, it is. It would have been horrible. Even then, there wouldn't have been much more comfort. This was one of the female cells. The castle housed female and male prisoners. We have records of babies being born in the prison. It housed all kinds of criminals, so you get the child criminals who have perhaps been jailed for a relatively minor offence, but you also had adult prisoners who had been jailed for very serious offences as well, all in the same building. There was an outcry towards the end of the 1800s to say that the conditions were inhumane, and that led to the building of a new prison in Victoria Road in Douglas. Interestingly, there are a couple of contemporary letters in the local newspapers when they were getting ready to move the prisoners out of Castle Rushen into Victoria Road to say how luxurious and palatial the new prison was in Victoria Road. So little echoes of recent history as well, similar sort of comments when the prison was built at Derby perhaps. But there was a influence from England as well about the conditions in the prison at Castle Rushen, which ultimately led to action being taken and it being closed down for that purpose.
You're listening to Exploring Island Heritage on Manx Radio. This week, we're exploring the history of Castle Rushen with curator of archaeology Alison Fox.
Certainly you've got to be good with heights to come up here.
Yeah, it's fairly solid. There's not too much danger up here, as long as you're careful. But this isn't quite the highest point of the castle at the moment. The highest point, the flag tower, is having conservation work done. But this is the bell tower. It looks out over Castletown. It's actually, as far as the keep structure of the castle goes, one of the later parts to be built. Actually, it was built in the 1600s, but it's connected to the clock mechanism, which we'll see when we start going down, and the bell that you can hear when the clock strikes is the bell that's here. It's quite a nice reminder of the Lords of Man, the Stanley family, who were given the Isle of Man and started to rule in the early 1400s. The Lords of Man from the Stanley family varied in their interest for the Isle of Man. Some of them came over, some of them didn't, but a few of them left the mark on the castle and also documentary evidence for the island as well. And it was one of the Stanleys that actually asked for the laws of the Isle of Man to be finally written down in the early 1400s. So it was from him that we've got a lot of evidence about various punishments for crimes such as treason, which could involve beheading and your head being put upon the gate of the castle.
So this is the mechanism really for what we've just been looking at the top.
It is. This is the castle clock mechanism, and it's another one of these objects that sort of sits here quite happily, quite unassuming, but it's incredibly rare, incredibly significant. There was always tales told that the clock mechanism was given to the Isle of Man by Queen Elizabeth I when the Isle of Man came under her direct rule after one of the Stanleys died in suspicious circumstances without an heir. And it's always been, it's been repeated, perhaps taken with a little bit of pinch of salt by some historians. A few years ago, one of the weights that helped drive the mechanism came off, and we had to take the clock back to the Manx Museum in Douglas to just do some repairs and some conservation work as well. Our conservator took the opportunity to get a radiocarbon date for the wooden frame that the mechanism sits in, and that came back that it actually within, give or take 20 years, it would fit in that Queen Elizabeth I date. So that's a really nice potential that it was actually a gift to the Isle of Man. If not from Queen Elizabeth I herself, then certainly during that time period. So, potentially a 500-year-old clock mechanism, which is still going. A little bit of grumbling when it first gets going at the start of the season, but it's still going, and it drives the one hand that you can see on the clock face from Castletown Square, and it also rings the bell on the hour as well that you can hear all around Castletown.
How rare is it that this has survived?
I think it is quite significant. We have there are domestic clocks, perhaps that more domestic scale clocks that perhaps date from this period, but this size from 500 years ago is pretty rare. There have been some replacement parts over the years. It's not fully original, but even some of those parts are getting on over 200 years old as well. So.
Now, the displays in this room are probably more what people would be used to coming into a museum or a heritage attraction.
Yeah, this is the highest room at the top of the castle, and this talks a little bit about the castle in the prison period, but also the different ways it's been depicted in art through the ages, and also a little bit about it as the administration centre of the island. Castle Rushen was essentially government buildings of its day during the 1800s and 1900s. It was where people would come to pay their taxes or, to have any other bits of government admin. It was all controlled from the castle. So it wasn't just a defensive site later on. This room was the last to be built in the keep. The height of the tower was raised during the late 1300s, early 1400s, and then the glacis, which is the now grass bank we see around the outside, was added in the 1500s. And both of those were as a response to different weaponry, really. Have a look at the windows of the castle on the lower levels. They're these sort of typical medieval arrow slit windows, very narrow, that you could fire an arrow through. As time progresses, and on the curtain wall, if you look now, you can see these windows that have changed to almost like dumbbell-shaped windows. They've got a hole at the bottom and a narrow split, and that's as a response to gunpowder and guns being more the weaponry that was used. And again, it's another reason why the height of the castle was raised, as a response to guns being used rather than bows and arrows being the main weapon, just in case. And we also have an ammunition room up here as well, which is where all the cannonballs and probably earlier the bows and arrows were kept as well. There's a little bit of a dispute in the 1700s when it was proposed that a gunpowder store was kept on the ground floor level of the castle, but surprisingly Castletown residents objected to that and said that it should stay within the central castle keep, which it did.
Presumably the modifications were to bring it up to date with modern armaments, but how much of a threat was there in any particular era?
Yeah, I think it's Every time it was a reaction to what was happening elsewhere. I think it's one of the things it's difficult to keep in mind, really, is that the Isle of Man was a strategic asset in the Viking period. So the Lords of Man who built the castle and the abbey and Peel Castle as well had a lot of control over what was happening to the island, and they had a lot of influence in other places. When their power waned and the Isle of Man came under control of England and then Scotland, and then it toed and froed, the island, it was more about England wanted to keep the Isle of Man so that Scotland couldn't get their hands on it, because it would be a good position for Scotland to launch attacks into England. So the threat that the castle was defending itself and the island against wasn't necessarily against the island, it was to perhaps the people who were in charge, and they were feeling threatened by some things, so they had to hold their position, and that happened to be on the Isle of Man. And that's why we the main periods of change to the castle are when it comes under English control and the Montacutes take over. There are still skirmishes with the English and the Scots. In the 1600s, in the Civil War, that's where we start to get more alterations as well, when the Stanley family actually came over and lived on the Isle of Man for a while as refuge from the Civil War. So it wasn't a specific threat to the Isle of Man so much as a reaction to what was happening elsewhere that might end up travelling over the Irish Sea and arriving here.
So we moved again.
We've moved back inside the keep, and we've come down a level, and we are standing in the most secure room in the most secure building in the Isle of Man. This is the Treasury of the castle. It would originally only have been reached by coming through the Lord's chamber, and if the Lord wasn't in there, there were probably some of his one of his officers stood not too far away. So this is where all the important stuff was kept. So very important official documents and things like that would have been kept in here. Some of the walls in the castle are 3 metres thick. You know, the limestone. There's no getting in here without permission. So this is one of these great little spaces in the castle.
Presumably, if you did get to here, you'd taken over.
Yeah, pretty much, or you weren't going to get out again.
Now, anyone who comes to Castle Rushen will probably find themselves in this room.
Yes, this is what we call the medieval banqueting room, I guess, medieval dining hall. The scene is set in the early 1500s, and we have the Lord of Man, Thomas Stanley, taking a dinner or lunch during the day with the most important people the most important officers on the Isle of Man at the time. So we can see the abbot there, nipped down from Rushen Abbey, to have lunch, the Lieutenant Governor, and on the end there, the controller, who basically was in charge of the admin and supplies for the castle. This is recreated, not necessarily exactly how Castle Rushen would have looked like. It's sort of been inspired by the kinds of things that we've got evidence for from other places. So we've got the wall hangings, these painted cloths. A lot of medieval places would have had tapestries. Tapestries were very expensive, and these painted or stained cloths were sometimes used instead. The wall hangings were specially designed for Castle Rushen, and the main one on the side wall shows scenes from the Battle of Bosworth, 1485. That battle is obviously hugely important as far as the English crown goes. The death of Richard III, which landed him in the car park in Leicester, and the taking over of the Tudor dynasty, so King Henry taking over. And the Stanley family again had quite an important role in that whole period of English history. And the legend goes that after the Battle of Bosworth, after Richard III was killed, then it was Thomas Stanley who handed the English crown to Henry Tudor, and that's what we show here. So again, it's this family that were in charge of the Isle of Man, but were actually really central to a lot of important parts and periods of English history as well.
When you're dealing with three distinct periods in time, effectively, at a site like this, how do you unpick it? Where do you start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I still don't know that I know the best way to do it. I think sometimes you can start at the beginning, which is a very good place to start. Other times, I think you just have to dive in at a particularly exciting or event or something that changed what had gone on before. For the interpretation at Castle Rushen, what we have just tried to do is to actually take 6 characters from the castle's history, to have a look in more detail at them, and to use those people's stories as illustrations as to the broader history of the castle. So for example, we have King Reginald, who we think built the initial stone tower. We have William Montacute from the 1300s. We have Ferdinando Stanley from the late 1500s. We have Countess Charlotte from during the Civil War. We have Dr. John Clegg from the prison period, and Armitage Rigby, who is the architect who was charged with putting the castle back together after it had stopped being a prison. So I think with a building as complicated as this one is, we can't tell every story in every room without completely overwhelming people. So what we've tried to do is to pick out some significant events, put that in context, and we are looking at a project of further improving the interpretation to perhaps try and give people some idea not only whereabouts in the castle they are, but what might have happened where they stood, because that's quite an important thing that can sometimes get lost if you're using lots and lots of words, is that, you know, events of historic significance happened here. It's not just a stone building that people come round and look at now. You know, decisions were made here that affected the Isle of Man's history, that affected more than the Isle of Man's history in the early stages. So it's trying to balance all that with having people leave with a sense of history of the castle, not knowing everything about the castle. Nobody knows everything about Castle Rushen, but to give people a little bit of comfort that they know a little bit more, and perhaps they might come back and just learn a little bit more, or perhaps just get a little bit more comfortable within the building as well.
Curator of Archaeology for Manx National Heritage, Alison Fox. That's it for this series of Exploring Island Heritage. Sincere thanks to everyone who's contributed to the programmes over the past 6 weeks.